Hey everyone, I'm Evan, and today we're going to be talking about fishing line. So you may have seen all the different lines. You have braid, mono, fluorocarbon coated lines, copolymer lines, and then you have hybrid lines like your fire line as well. So you may be wondering, with all these different lines, where should you get started? What's the advantages and disadvantages of all of these lines? And what are the real world practical applications to using each of these lines? We'll go through those today. Today we're going to focus on the three main lines, that being mono, braid, and fluorocarbon. And first we're going to look at monofilament, or mono. Now this is because it is a very common line, especially among beginners and people just learning how to fish. Now there's some big reasons for this, and the largest one being that it's inexpensive. You can buy like a 1200 yard spool for less than $10. And some of them are even cheaper than that, especially when you get into your smaller lines. Now, besides cost, what does mono offer over the other two main lines? So mono can be used on all of your main reels, like your spin cast, spinning, and bait caster reels. Mono has a lot of abrasion resistance, so if you fish around rocks or anything else any kind of sharp objects or abrasive objects, it's a good line to use for that. And additionally, it has a lot of stretch in it, which can be good or bad, but whenever you are inexperienced making a hook set, or if you have your drag set tighter, it's just much more forgiving in a lot of situations. You're not going to break the line as easily, especially as what you will with braided line. The main uses of mono, you see it a lot used pretty heavily in pan fishing, where you can get away with very small, lightweight lines using between 2 to 6 pound tests on a lot of the bluegill, red ear, and crappie lines. It can be used on bass fishing and catfishing and all of your major types of fishing as well. The main uses of where I use monofilament line is with my pan fishing rods, and I have it on one of my bass fishing rods at Black Max. And then another big use that I have for this is catfishing. Since mono has such great abrasion resistance, I use this as a leader line on some of my catfishing rigs. This is 60 pound trilene big game. You can see that it's a fairly thick line. This is a snelled hook that'll be used for the bottom of a Carolina rig. So the downsides to monofilament though, the diameter of the line relative to the strength of the line is much lower than your braided lines or your fluorocarbon, especially your braided lines. This line does not last very long, so you have to replace the line on the spool much more often than some of your other lines. The stretch in the line can be both a good and a bad thing. If a lot of the bass fishermen, they want to have a harder hook set, and with the mono being stretchier, it's harder to get that hard hook set for a bass. So there's many fishermen who opt to use a different line for that. And then the memory in the line too, whenever we roll this line off, you see that it is twisted, and this can present some challenges with wind knots and getting tangled up in general. So now let's talk about braided line. A braided line can be used for a wide variety of applications. It can be used anywhere from your small panfish all the way up to offshore ocean fishing. The biggest advantage that braided line offers over the other two is its relative small diameter to the breaking strength. This is 80 pound braid. It has roughly the same diameter as 18 pound mono. So as you can imagine, that can get you a much higher line capacity in a reel, or it can offer a much higher break strength for the same line capacity. So for catfishing, my personal use is to use braided line as the main line, and then use a monofilament leader, which I had shown earlier. For bass fishing, it's pretty common too. It allows you to have, like I said, a higher breaking strength versus the diameter. So that allows you to have most any application. It's used in topwater pretty heavily because another characteristic of it is that it tends to float on water. So with a topwater, you're fighting the bait from sinking more. So you can throw it in heavy cover. You can use anywhere from 30 pounds all the way up to 80 pounds for bass fishing. Another characteristic that makes it different from especially mono is that it has very little, if any, stretch. So what that allows you to do is have a much harder hook set, and this is important in bass fishing to try to get a hard hook set right away. In pan fishing, you're typically going to be using a much lighter line. I don't use braided line for pan fishing, but you can use anywhere from like a 6 pound all the way up to 15 pounds. because 15 pounds will probably be the equivalent to around 4-pound mono, so you'll have a very thin line but still be very strong. In most of these applications though, braided line is normally going to be ran to a liter of either mono or fluorocarbon. Now with braided line having very little stretch, this can be problematic too whenever you hook something with a drag on a reel turned up too high, and if you have very light braided line, you can break on a hook set. But if your drag's turned right, that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Braid's very visible in water, so that's another reason why people run leaders. It's very common in a lot of your fishing to run braid as your main line and to run a leader. One advantage I have seen personally with braid that I have not heard too many people talk about is when you are stuck with something and you need to break the line off, breaking braid is much easier than mono or fluorocarbon since there's very little, if any, stretch in it. Now you have to use either a dowel rod or a stick or something like that because the braided line will eat into your hand, but whenever you're actually trying to break it, you don't have to keep on going back further and further like you will with a heavy test mono. Another advantage that you have if you're running stronger line in general, I find that I lose less baits and less hooks. The last main line we're going to talk about today is fluorocarbon. This is the line that I have the least experience with, but it's a pretty interesting line. Now, fluorocarbon does not have as many applications as what the other two do. Fluorocarbon is generally at least as expensive as braid, if not more expensive. And I would consider this the most difficult line to use. There are many drawbacks to fluorocarbon. The memory is very bad in it. It's so bad, in fact, a lot of people recommend against using it on spinning rod applications as the main line and only using it for a leader line. So while using braided line, while it's expensive, you get a nice long life out of braid, which is not true for fluorocarbon. It does not have the stretch that mono does, but it has a little bit more stretch than what braid does. So you may be wondering why people use fluorocarbon at all, considering it's expensive, it doesn't last long, it's not very forgiving, and it's a pain to use. And that's because of the translucency in water. Some people say that fluorocarbon is almost invisible in water. It is the least visible out of all three lines by far. You have braid, which sticks out like a sore thumb. You have mono, which you'll be able to see the regular line. And then you have fluorocarbon, which you can see very little. Most of the time, whenever you see people using fluorocarbon, it's going to be as a leader material. Typically for whenever people are using braided line, they're going to be using some type of a leader. Whenever you're bass fishing or fishing for other sight predators, it's pretty common to use fluorocarbon, so the fish can't hardly see the line itself. Fluorocarbon is going to be a little bit lower in diameter than mono, and it's going to offer really good abrasion resistance too, just like monofilament. Personally, my only application for fluorocarbon is using it as a leader on braided line. Now, there are some people that will use straight fluorocarbon for bait casters because they can handle it. And you'll see some people use them for spinning reels too. So after hearing all this, you might be wondering what the real world application and what my exact uses are for this line. So I'll go through them real quick. So for pan fishing, I'll use usually around 4 to 6 pound monofilament. For bass fishing, I'll use either like a 12-pound mono, or I've recently started using more of 30-pound braid, and then I'll run that down to a 17-pound fluorocarbon. This, I feel like I can get better casting distance along with the fish seeing the line less. The obvious downside to this is that it's much more expensive than just using mono. For catfishing and for fishing for bowfin, I'll use 80-pound braid, and then I will run that down to a leader of 60-pound monofilament, Berkeley Big Game. And for carp fishing, I just use my catfishing rod, so I'll run the 80-pound braid, and I run that down to a 30-pound braided leader. A braid leader is pretty common for carp fishing, although in the future, I would like to get specific carp fishing rods, and then at which point I'll be using around a 30 or 40-pound braided line. One interesting note is that with the braided line lasting so long, if you're using this as a main line, it can in some cases be cheaper in the long run than using mono, because with mono you're having to strip the mono off. It doesn't last very long, only 6 months or a year is really all you're going to get out of it, especially with heavier usage. For braided line, as long as the line looks and feels okay, you can keep on using it for years. So if you guys have any questions about the content that I covered in this video, feel free to ask, or any application specific questions. Maybe you're fishing for a certain species and you're wondering what line to use or what leader to use. Feel free to ask them in the comment section below, or if you guys have general comments on what you like the best for certain applications, please be sure to leave them below. We all have different experiences, and maybe your comments can help someone else out in their applications. So thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time.